crisis to any comic book fan is a code word. The code to the comic book fan is something creatively important is taking place here. Come experience it.
My name is Paul Levitz, and I've had the fun of being the publisher during most of the Crises series post-Crisis on Infinite Earths.
I'm Rags Morales, and I was the penciler of Identity Crisis. My mother told me I was drawing since I was 3. She thought I was weird because I'd rather sit in a corner with a bunch of paper, you know, your typical typing paper, and draw rather than go out and play.
My name's Jeff Johns, and I was the writer on Infinite Crisis. Crisis really was a doorway for me because it was so vast and so big.
I'm Mike Carlin, and I'm the senior group editor at DC Comics, and I was the editor on Identity Crisis. Comic books were always something that was cool in my house, and I learned that that's an unusual situation. Most people's moms threw out the comics when they found them. My mother would wait till I went to bed and then read my comics.
My name is Brad Meltzer, and I'm the writer of Identity Crisis. I remember my comics used to come to me. I didn't have a car, I was too little, so the guy at the local comic store, it was such a low-rent comic store, he used to bring the comics on Friday night. He would call me up and tell me what the dollar amount was, and I would leave the dollar amount under our family mat, and then he would slide the comics under the mat and take the money, and we would come back from dinner or wherever we were, and there'd be a stack of comics below our mat. It was like an old-school drug deal.
My name is Dan DiDio. I'm executive editor, senior vice president at DC Comics, executive editor over the DC Universe. I literally came in right after September 11th. I mean, that's when I started. We're looking at a world that was post 9/11. That's when this was all coming to be. And I was doing a lot of traveling. I was in a lot of airports, but also I was coming to work and coming into Manhattan. And one of the things that I felt immediately different was people with machine guns standing in Port Authority. Vests, machine guns, ready for something to happen. They're there to inspire confidence, but you're getting a different feeling. You get a feeling of dread. And then we thought about that, applying that sensibility to our superheroes.
My name's Michael Uslan. I may be the executive producer of all of the Batman movies, from Batman to The Dark Knight, but more importantly, I'm a comic book reader. I'm a comic book fan. I love what I do, and if I didn't love what I do so much, if I hadn't made my passion for comic books into my work, I would be in a loony bin somewhere already.
Actually, the first comic I bought off the newsstand was one of the parts of Crisis on Earth 1, Earth 2, the original story in Justice League in the 1960s.
Identity Crisis, as well as all of the big Crisis books and events that DC has published over the years, are predicated on the existence of what we have all come to refer to as the DCU, the DC Universe. The origin of the DC Universe goes back to 1940. World's Fair was taking place in New York City. DC Comics had a special agreement, a license with the fair, to produce a special big oversized edition called World's Fair Comics. World's Fair Comics 1940 had a very unique, interesting, and historic cover. On that cover is a picture of Superman, Batman, and Robin. It's the first time these three characters appeared in one picture at one time. And all of a sudden, fans could look at this and say for the first time, Superman, that guy from Metropolis, lives in the same universe as Batman and Robin from Gotham City. The next major step to the emergence of a DCU was All-Star Comics #3. And under Shelley Mayer, a decision was made to present the major superheroes from the different magazines published by DC, and they put them all into one adventure. All-Star Comics #3 was one giant leap for comic fandom.
The first moment when I thought that comics had any relevance as a career was when I read a Legion letter column and it talked about Jim Shooter, age 13, writing the comic. And I was all of 9 years old, and 13 seemed like an age people might grow up to be, as opposed to the ancient grown-ups who I suspected were doing it.
When I was younger, I was very much a DC guy. Crisis on Infinite Earths, I actually bought right when I started buying comics. So I didn't know who anybody was, I didn't know what was going on, but I liked trying to figure out who all these characters were. They were all brand new to me.
Crisis on Infinite Earths in 1984 was written primarily by Marv Wolfman. Marv was a fanboy. The story he would write would inspire the fanboys of that day, the kids who were reading comics in 1984 and opening up their imaginations to what could be, what they had never seen before, to take these superheroes and villains to places that they had never gone to before, and to fire their imaginations.
When my fourth book, The Millionaires, came out, the very last person in line at my book signing was Bob Schreck, who was the editor at that point in time of Green Arrow. And he came to me and said, Kevin Smith is leaving Green Arrow, and would you like a shot? And I looked up at him and I said, you know, don't say this if you don't mean it, because I've been waiting my whole life for someone to ask me that. And he said, we mean it. The comics that I loved best from DC when I was little is I remember reading the New Teen Titans, and I remember reading the Great Darkness saga that Paul Levitz did. And the reason I love those more than just about anything was they were mysteries.
I remember the first time I met Brad, is poking his head in the office and basically standing up to do the usual ceremonial, hi, how are you, nice to have you at DC kind of stuff. And he starts doing a riff on two of my Legion stories, arguing about which was the better mystery.
And I just couldn't hold it in any longer, and I just said, I just want you to know the Great Darkness saga is one of the great mysteries I ever read. And I totally geeked out, and he very appreciatively said, well, I have a signed copy here of the new printing, and I was so excited.
Okay, this guy's been around this a while. It was a very sweet compliment.
I was coming in from the outside world, so it did take a little getting used to working at DC, because it was definitely a different beast. And the first thing you had to do is shake out the fanboy in you. I remember the first time I met Frank Miller as an employee of DC Comics. And you had to take a half step back, because the first thing you wanted to do is just gush about how much you've loved his work over the years and how much of an honor it was to meet.
Dan DiDio had moved in as our new editorial leader for the DC Universe. And one of Dan's theses for developing the line was that we didn't have enough risk going on in the books.
When you look at comics of the 70s and comics of the 60s, you see the sensibilities of the times of working their ways into the storytelling and how characters acted and behaved. And now that we're in a post-9/11 world, you saw a lot of the feeling of the people starting to invade the characters and the stories that we were telling in comics then too.
Comics were maturing. Comics were becoming more sophisticated in story, characterization, and artwork.
And in that post-9/11 world, when this book was being developed, we realized that there are really amazing, incredible, horrible, animalistic ways that we hurt each other. We are cavemen living with the best, most powerful tools on the world.
9/11 was an extraordinarily powerful reminder that heroism wasn't something just of works of fiction, but when you saw the film footage of a firefighter or a first responder running into the building as it's burning, as it's starting to collapse, with the overtone that they're going to die, you don't know whether they know they're going to die in it, but boy, it sure doesn't look like something you're likely to come out of okay. But they're doing their job and they're doing it with courage and they were saving life after life through that, I think it was a very powerful reminder.
And you saw the sensibilities, the attitudes, the tone of everything change immediately. Perceptions of Americans overseas changed, perceptions of ourselves changed. There was tenser moments on the planes. There was a different attitude in the airport. Everything was different. And our senses of what heroes were was different also coming out of that. Who was a hero? What it took to be a hero was different.
I think that Identity Crisis came up because of a lunch that Paul and Dan DiDio had, where Paul suggested that we try to raise the stakes and do a story that defines what it means to be a superhero that would maybe take us in a different direction.
We decided to raise the stakes. Not just, hey, put out, don't get the cat out of the tree, stop the bank robbery. What's gonna really make an effect? How do you change people's lives, even at the cost of your own? That's the center of what the books became about. And when we were building Identity Crisis, when we saw that was taking hook, we realized that wasn't just a one-off idea. That was something that had to permeate throughout the DC universe.
And Dan said to me, that's what the kind of story we want from you. We want something that makes us feel that when our characters are putting on their uniforms, even though they have capes and utility belts, that they may die.
But Dan's mission statement was really to kick it up a notch. It was always to not be quiet, to not just do our books and do our books and kind of keep our heads down. He wanted to get out there, and he's really provided, I think, a great fire for everybody. And he always had a clear drive for all this stuff, very clear drive from Identity Crisis to Infinite Crisis.
The fundamental challenge of the Crisis stories over the years is that you have to come up with something that is complex enough, important enough, that it justifies having the wide range of the DC characters in it.
Crisis really was a doorway for me because it was so vast and so big, and it did something that Marvel didn't do. I'd pick up a Marvel book and it felt very pedestrian to me compared to a DC comic book. They felt very grounded and realistic, which I guess in my comics I wanted something bigger and more fantastic.
Well, I think the run-up to Identity Crisis is a time of transition.
When they got me on the phone with Dan DiDio, they said, we'd love to do the small emotional story. I'll never forget those words, a small emotional story.
I hate to contradict Brad, but I'm sure we never say anything small. Everything is hyperbolic and over the top when we request it.
I don't know if Brad was chosen to write the story or whether the story chose him, to be very frank about it. Brad had a story he wanted to tell. He was looking to do a Justice League story because Justice League is something near and dear to his heart. But he wanted a story that had some real weight to it, some real bite, some real gravitas. And when he came up with the story, we realized that this Justice League story just wasn't a Justice League story. It was something that affected the entire DC universe. And ultimately, it went from being a Justice League story to becoming Identity Crisis.